Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about costing. Everything from hosting infrastructure to licensing and subscriptions, and even office space and resourcing. We're going to take a look at two scenarios, a solo developer and a small startup. And then we're going to take a look at cost reduction strategies. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned and let's get started. All right, there's a lot that goes into running a SaaS business, but how much it costs really depends on how complicated you want your business to be. Obviously, the more people you hire, the more it's going to cost. Now, let's get started with the basics. If you're running a SaaS, you're hosting it somewhere, right? So you need to pay for compute, storage, egress. This is network bandwidth going out, and logging, potentially. In development, so you need to do that for production. That's where your customers are using. And then development, that's where developers are using. Now, usually at the very beginning of development, you'll probably pay nothing or very little. But as your application grows, after you've launched it, it's gonna scale out to where production starts to cost more than development. Now, we're gonna have concrete numbers for this in the next section, so stay tuned for that. Let's move on to licensing and subscriptions. Now, you can build everything from scratch, and then it's gonna be free. But if you wanna get to market quickly, you probably want to buy some things versus build. And one of those things that I would recommend buying is commercial libraries. Now, there are a lot of libraries that you can use that are free. But if you want anything that isn't free, don't hesitate to spend an extra X amount of dollars just to buy that. It's always going to be yours. Most of the companies, most of the libraries sold by companies are one-time purchase and you own it. And the ones that aren't, it's just that maybe they're not as good as they advertise. Trust me. I'm not going to name any names, but there are the usual suspects that charge a subscription fee for using their components. Don't do that. There's also the expense that is Office software. So this is things like Microsoft Office. Now you can get some discounts there, of course, like a new startup discount can get like up to a year or some credits, for starting. So you can get it for free initially, but you are eventually going to have to pay. Third-party per-seat subs. So this is things like, let's say you have a CI/CD pipeline that you're paying for. You can check out some of the CI/CDs in my previous video. Those cost per seat. Or maybe you have a GitHub Enterprise that you're also paying per seat. So there are some subscriptions that you're gonna have to pay for that you'll be paying per seat, meaning however many people you need to have access to that, that's how much you're gonna be paying. So you can minimize the costs there by just restricting which of your employees have access to what and minimize your costs that way. Now, some companies won't let you do that. They will say, how many people are in your company? Oh, you got 10 people in your company? All right, 10 seats. Even if just 4 of those are developers. And you need to negotiate that kind of stuff, right? Like, well, you don't need to use that product, for example. You can walk away. Or just don't tell them you have 10 people, just tell you have 5 people. And the thing is the companies that charge per seat want to make as much money as possible, because that kind of pricing is kind of predatory if you think about it, right? Like it doesn't cost them any more if 2 people have access to something than 3 people, but it costs you a lot more. So just keep that in mind when you're buying some of these subscriptions. There are also other subscriptions that you're gonna have to pay for that I can't think of the top of my head, but just keep in mind that you're gonna be paying on a monthly basis for certain things when running your SaaS. Oh, I just thought of one, project management software, right? Not listed here, but potentially. Now, these two sections, Office and People, I'm not like HR, right? I'm a software engineer. So I run some numbers. I talked to some people whom I know about how much these things cost. But for example, office space varies wildly depending on where you are. Are you in the downtown core of a major metropolitan area? Or are you in the suburbs? Or are you in the boonies? Or maybe you're fully remote and then you don't need to worry about those costs, right? And same with people, right? If you are in Seattle or San Francisco or New York, you're going to be paying salaries for those areas. That is also where most of the talent is, coincidentally. But you got to keep that also in mind. So it's going to vary greatly. So the numbers we're going to look at next in these two scenarios are going to reflect these realities. So let's take a look. I have a spreadsheet here. I know, super exciting, right? I have two scenarios, solo and startup. Let's take a look at a solo entrepreneur, right? So you're just starting out, you're a software engineer, and you're like, I want to build my own SaaS. This is what you can expect to pay. So as you're developing, let's say you're hosting on a VM, you're paying $5 for that VM. Okay, let's just say maybe $10. You're paying $10 for that VM. You're paying some egress bandwidth because nothing's really ever free. You're going to be paying at least a little bit for egress. Storage, it is highly likely that as you're developing, you're probably going to pay nothing because you won't be storing that much stuff. And then monitoring and logging, again, the free quotas are enough to get you going during development. You probably don't need to pay anything. Now, as you grow, as you release into production, everything's going to start costing more. And as you scale your application, these costs will increase. So I bumped it up here. I bumped up these numbers, and I have some notes that I want to kind of briefly touch on with regards to infrastructure. This is what I'm most familiar with. We'll talk about people and office space in the next scenario. So for infrastructure, for compute, if you're using a level 2 platform like Railway, Cloudflare, Render, Vercel, they're going to be relatively cheap for compute. It's a really good deal, actually. And I will touch on later why you may want to use these in the next scenario instead of a level 1 infrastructure like AWS or Azure. But compute's going to be relatively cheap. Storage, also, as I said, for the free tier for development is probably going to carry into production as well. And depending on your application, it could potentially even be free, even in production. Or it could be the opposite. Compute could be relatively cheap, or storage could be pretty expensive. It really depends on what you're hosting, what your application does, because if you're using hot storage, meaning storage that's accessed all the time, that's gonna be expensive. It's gonna run you a lot of money to use hot storage. And we're gonna talk about mitigation strategies at a later point in the video, but just keep in mind these numbers here are an example of what you could be paying, but it will vary based on your application. So egress and monitoring and logging, in development, egress is gonna cost you something, probably no more than $5. And monitoring logging, it's free. As you go into production, you want a little bit more information, probably about what your customers are doing. and any audit logs, stuff like that. And that's all gonna store somewhere, and you're gonna have to pay for that storage for logging. And egress, obviously, as more people are using your application, you're sending more data out, you're paying for that too. So I would say that the initial cost of your production application, given, I don't know, 30, 50 customers, maybe 100, is about $100. It's not gonna be a lot, but it might be about $100. But then again, I wanna just say it really depends on what your application is doing, right? If you're storing a lot of data, it's gonna be more than $100. So let's move on to other expenses. As a solo entrepreneur, you can use lots of free libraries, and I would really urge you to do that. There are a lot of cool free libraries for React, for Nuxt, for Blazor, like other frameworks. You just use those. Honestly, don't pay for stuff you don't need to pay for. And as far as subscriptions, if you're a solo developer, you don't need to pay for this. The GitHub free tier, it's got you covered. Actions, projects, and code, you can store that all for free. And then Office software, personally, I use Office 365 at home. I have like a family edition, and I would use that. But if you don't, you can just use Google's free Office suite, or actually even Microsoft has a free office.com that you can use even without a subscription. So if you need Office software, you can use that. That also goes for project management, which is baked in here, GitHub projects, and all the other project management software, which we talked about in the previous video. They also have free tiers, so you can use that. So you shouldn't really have to pay anything for Office software. All right, and now people, well, you're not paying anything, right, for people, because you're just you. And this is your side gig, so you're paying with your time. Same with office space. You're not really paying anything because you're at home. Like me, I'm at home. If I'm coding from here, I'm not paying anything. I mean, let's not get philosophical here. Obviously, I'm paying for electricity, this light costs money and stuff like that. But really, let's be real, Office is free. So here are the totals. So if you're a developer, solo entrepreneur, monthly $15. $15 a month, $180 a year. In production, let's say 90, you're paying about, let's just say it's 1,200, right? Let's bump this up to 20 to make it a nice round number. $1,200 in production per year, if you're a solo entrepreneur. Okay, now let's look at scenario 2. In this scenario, you're a founder with an idea, but you need somebody to execute on that idea. You need a crew. Not like Ocean's 11 or whatever, but you need to have probably at least 5 people. Maybe start with 4, bring on sales marketing once you're ready for that. So I'm assuming if you need a developer, you're gonna hire a developer who can do a lot of various work on the project. That isn't just like a backend developer or just like someone that's like good at React, right? Like not that kind of developer. You need a developer that can do everything. A full stack developer. So now that we got that covered, let's take a look at costs as they would look. We're gonna go through this a little bit faster. Compute development is probably gonna be about $60. In most cases, even on tier 2 platforms, you're paying per seat for access, for developer access, shared developer access. Now you could kind of get away without doing this for development by having just one person be able to deploy and have other people just checking code into GitHub. So you could probably reduce that cost a little bit, but it's just $60. In the grand scheme of things, as we'll go down below. If you see the salary, right? Like $60 is peanuts compared to the other stuff that you're paying. Egress for development is going to be the same. And office software, it's probably going to be about $100. And here, it's going to be a bit more expensive because the moment you start collaborating, the moment you start bringing in additional developers, you will notice that some of the office software is like, hey, if you have more than one person, you got to pay. Okay. Some software you could have like 5 people, up to 5 maybe, or up to 10 or whatever, and then it's still free, but it's going to be a little bit limited. And I think you can at least expect to pay at least $100 for office software. Licensing and subscriptions, you can still get away with not having to pay for that, at least up front. And now let's talk about people, right? Actually, you know what? Before talking about people, let's just look at the production numbers. They're not going to be much different because really what you're doing is you're just paying more people to build your software. You're not necessarily paying more for infrastructure because you have more customers. So the reason why here production compute is more expensive is the same reason as in development. So it's just going to cost a little bit more because you need more developers to have access. But as I mentioned previously, you could shrink that number by reducing access, right? You could also have a VM if you want. If you're not using a tier 2 developer, you could host in a VM, which is then it's going to be vastly cheaper than $100. So there are some ways to minimize this cost, but realistically, it doesn't really matter as much because really what matters is how much you're going to be paying people. So here's where the costs get kind of ridiculous. Now, if you look at the formula up here, I put $150K for a senior full stack developer. Now, this is, I would say, on the lower end of what a seriously good senior full stack developer is going to cost. My guess is that in 2024 or 25, I guess, soon, somebody who really knows how to build an application is going to be running at least in the Seattle area where I live, going to be like 200, 180, 200-ish, somewhere around there. And I'm talking about, this is the person who's going to architect and write most of the code. 150, I would say that's like the bare minimum. You have a full stack dev under that senior full stack dev. That maybe is somebody with 2-3 years of experience, maybe not super experienced, but knows how to write code, but also knows how to write front end and back end code. You need somebody like that because the senior full stack dev is going to be focusing on architecture of the application, infrastructure architecture, stuff like that. You need somebody to actually write the code on the front end and the back end alongside the senior full stack dev. And I said, I put 100K here. Again, this is like my experience in the Seattle area. Out in Idaho or Oklahoma or something, maybe it's going to be cheaper. But talent is mostly found in the coastal areas and in Texas. So these are the prices that I kind of pulled off of Indeed, levels.io or FYI, levels.fyi that you can look at. So these are the prices for, and then we have another senior product manager, maybe 70K, and sales and marketing, and you can run your own payroll. So I put the salaries here for the developers. Oh, you know what? I forgot to pay the sales and marketing person. But the reason they're not included in here is that at the very beginning, when you're first starting out, you're not going to need the sales and marketing person. They're going to come in later, right? So that's why they're not here in this formula just yet. All right, now benefits. If you want to attract good talent, you're going to need to have some benefits. You're going to need to have health insurance. And that is approximately between 10 to 20% of someone's salary. I mean, if I look at my own salary breakdown, the money that I get and the benefits that the company pays, on top of the contributions that I have to pay as well, it is like 18% or something. So I just put 20% to be on the safer side. So for each person, on average, you're paying 26.6K in salary per month. Sorry, not for each person, total, for the 3 people. And then you're paying $5,333 for benefits, and then you have taxes. Onboarding is a one-time cost. So if you are a founder and you yourself found the engineers, maybe you don't have to pay a recruiter, great, but you'd have to buy them a laptop. And if you want an office, you're gonna have to rent that out. And as I mentioned earlier, office space is expensive, but it really depends on where you are, right? Where I live in Seattle area, places like downtown Seattle or Bellevue, even Redmond or Kirkland, those are going to be very expensive. But the moment you move out from those areas out into suburbs, I mean, most of those are suburbs. What I mean is, as you move away from the business parks, prices will go down. So it can vary anywhere from $2,000 to $15,000. Again, it really depends on your requirements. Maybe you want a gym in there, a kitchenette, something, like you want it to have a nice view, right? All of that costs money. So if you're thinking you want to save an office, maybe go remote. Developers like remote work. We have things like furniture. So this is just a one-time payment upfront. $700 for a desk, $200 for a chair, $400 for 2 monitors. So you're looking at what, $1,300, $1,500. And you got 5 people, including sales and marketing and yourself. So it's about $7,500 up front. Again, napkin math. Don't take these numbers in too hard. Like, it's just rough math here. Coffee and tea. This is more like amenities. It's going to cost a little bit every month. So the monthly total we're looking at is $38,865, which turns out to be $466,000 per year to run that very small startup. Now, as you can see, these costs here are the most expensive. We're going to talk about how to mitigate some of these costs promptly, but just to keep in mind, in the big picture, this, and if you're just looking at these costs up here, it's inconsequential, right? Hosting and this is just like, it's nothing compared to how much people cost, how much office costs, stuff like that. So let's move on then and take a look, now that your eyes are bleeding looking at these numbers, how we can mitigate some of these costs. So cost reduction strategies. Now I want to talk about mitigating office cost first, because it's the simplest one. Don't have an office. Software engineers like working remotely, and if you enable that, give them that freedom to work from home, first of all, you don't have to pay for an office. And second of all, your engineers are happy. Now, not all engineers, obviously, some prefer to be in office. Like I like to come in, not every day, but I like to be in office. But most engineers will appreciate being able to work from home. So you can save a lot of money there by just not having an office. Saving on people costs, they can do that too. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But first thing I want to talk about is simple strategies to save money as you scale. So first thing is host on pay for what you use platforms and have scaling caps. So that basically means host on a platform where you're only paying for compute when you actually use compute. So things like serverless functions, right? Lambdas, Azure functions. You're only paying when they spin up and then you're not paying after they spin down. So you're only paying for that compute that you used. In some cases you can do this, in other cases you can't, but you should think as you're architecting your application where you can do that. And then the second thing is set caps for usage. So if you have compute constantly running and you're constantly paying, you're potentially serverless functions are dangerous. You could pay a ton of money. You want to have a hard cap, so it cuts you off and you won't be able to run that function anymore. Now that is a lot better to have an impact to your customer and say, hey, our server is down currently for whatever, 2 hours or 3 hours while we fix an issue, than if you have to pay, $80K because your serverless function just had an infinite loop or something. So hard caps are good. Have them set up. Another thing that you'll notice is this egress here. I put that in because a lot of these platforms like Railway, Vercel, and Render and all these other ones, they will give you a free tier, and even the non-free tier is going to look very cheap. And you'll be like, all right, well, great, I can host my application for nearly free. And then you're going to get a bill and you're like, what the hell is this? Why does it say $200 here, even though, whatever, I have $5 plan or $10 plan? That is because you have a lot of network bandwidth going out. And you can mitigate this by caching. It's going to get a little bit more complicated, your code is, but it's necessary if you want to save money, especially if you have egress for things like videos, media of any sort. So you're paying for that network bandwidth, the upload network bandwidth. You can mitigate it with caching. I also put a note here that you may pay for egress even when you don't know it. So if you have a service, now this is not everywhere, not on every platform, but some platforms, Azure, you may pay for, excuse me, something got in my throat. You may pay for moving data from US West to Europe. Even though it's within Azure, you're still paying for it. So let's keep that in mind. Wait, did I say Azure out loud? My bad. Another mitigation strategy, we already talked about this. Leverage the free tier as much as possible. So in hosting and storage, you're gonna get some free credits. Try to fit within those free credits. This is really pretty easy, especially during development time. But one thing I want to warn you about is vendor lock-in. This is something like most people on YouTube will talk about. You start with a service because it's cheap, it's easy to use. So you start with it, you host all your stuff on there, but you host it in a way that locks you into that vendor. And now if they raise their prices, you're screwed because you can't move off of that vendor, right? So lots of stories like this out there. You don't want to be that guy that's locked in. So have Docker files for everything and have strategies and scripts for copying your data off of the platform. Be prepared. But you can leverage the free tier as much as possible, at least to get your product out the door, right? And last thing is, you can use the free component libraries. They're really good and they're constantly releasing new ones. There's no reason not to use free component libraries, just use them. And if you need a commercial one, you can pay for that. But if you want to mitigate your costs, just use a free one. Keep in mind, build versus buy is nebulous, but it's important because you're paying a developer to build something versus paying for a component library. So if a developer takes, 2 weeks to build something and you're paying a developer $100 an hour, 40 times 100, or I guess 80 because 2 weeks times 100, right? Like you see the math here, right? You could have just paid for the control and be done. All right, let's move on to how to save on people costs. Now, DevOps it's a new category of developer. It's how you release your product, right? How you deploy your product to a cloud provider. Now, depending on the complexity of your product, you may have like 50 services or 20 services, whatever, and you need to host them all. You start researching online and you're like, how do I host services? And the first thing that pops up is Kubernetes. Kubernetes is the orchestrator of choice for hosting multiple services. So you start reading about it more and more, and suddenly you're a DevOps engineer. Just kidding, it's not that easy, but it gets complicated. The moment you bring like Kubernetes and Docker and stuff like that into the equation, you start complicating things. Now, of course, Kubernetes is not that hard. Okay, once you learn about the YAML syntax, Helm charts, stuff like that, it's not that complicated. But you need someone there to do all that for you. And the senior full stack engineer whom you're paying $150K, they need to be building the product. They shouldn't be playing with the infrastructure. And that is where you bring in the tier 2 platforms. So things like Railway, which I have videos about on my channel. You can host your stuff there and it's trivial. It is so stupid easy. Just use those. Once you get your product out the door and it starts to get more complicated and you're thinking, okay, well, maybe Railway is too expensive or I'm paying too much for egress. Maybe you want to self-host. Okay, at that point, your product already big enough, people are paying you money. Maybe you can afford to hire a DevOps engineer. But until then, tier 2 hosting platforms is the way to go. Now, I also want to say that using free component libraries also ties into saving on people costs, because you're not paying somebody to build UI for you. Simple, right? You're not paying a front-end engineer to build a UI for you. You're just picking up UI components, piecing them together into one single software. So it's a lot easier, a lot faster, less friction, cheaper. The other thing I want to touch on here that's also very important is the right storage strategy for your data. Now, I talked earlier about hot tiers. So you have generally, when you're storing your data, you have a hot tier and cold storage and like Glacier. Actually, that's a product name, AWS Glacier. So you can store data in storage, data that is accessible easily and quickly in hot storage. It's the most expensive storage. Then you have cold storage. That's literally what you think it is. Storage that is cold, meaning, not physically, obviously, not like temperature wise, but it's slow and it takes a while to access that storage. So performance is not good, but it's cheaper, usually on spindle drives, stuff like that. And then you have Glacier, which is storage that you're not going to be accessing, but you can like refetch it and make it hot, but that's going to cost. But usually Glacier is used for like archiving or something. So hot and cold, those are the two types of storages that you need to really be worried about. And most of the time, storing things in cold storage, it's unlikely that you're going to have to do this unless you are a data-driven application. So if you're training an algorithm or you have some kind of telemetry coming in, maybe you're storing that in cold storage for X amount of months or years. So just make sure that you're not storing in hot and you're storing in cold as much as you can. That'll save you a lot of money. Now, modern standards, you may be thinking, well, how am I going to save money on modern standards? It's common sense, right? I should be using common coding standards, modern coding standards. But what I actually mean here is it's a hidden cost. If you're using software, ancient software, that has poor UI, poor user experience functionality, and all this other, like, poor everything, it takes brain effort to use that software, resulting in lower productivity, resulting in employees taking more time to do things, resulting in you spending more money on those employees. So you know, and it's a hidden cost because it doesn't cost money right up front, but it's there. Trust me, I've been on the receiving end of this. I've been made to use ancient software, which then made me very unproductive. And my manager was like, hey, suddenly you're not as productive anymore. I'm like, yeah, because I have to use Oracle. Or rather, I had to integrate with Oracle APIs. So actually, they don't even have APIs, right? It's SOAP. On that note, let's move on from my trauma. But just think about the brain cost of using like low quality applications and how that translates to developer time, because you're paying those developers. And we just talked about this here. Turn off compute when not in use. This doesn't necessarily save on like people cost. This is more like about infrastructure, but if you're already using serverless functions, you're mostly good to go. But you can save even more money if you turn off environments when they're not in use. So you may have like a production environment, staging environment, development environment, and maybe on Saturdays and Sundays, no one there, no one coding. You turn off the dev environment. Maybe when you're not releasing software, you turn off staging environment because you're not doing a release or something, right? So these are the kinds of strategies you can also employ to further reduce your cost. All right, and then the last thing I want to talk about are things that are completely people don't think about at all. Breaches, security breaches. You know the saying like you get what you pay for, or you can't make money without spending money. Well, this is one of those cases. If you do not pen tests, pen testing means penetration testing. So you hire a company to try to break into your application, like break the security of your application and get all your clients' data. You hire someone to pen test your software. You have to pay them. It's not going to be cheap. But once you have your software written, you hire the company, they find some flaws, they tell you about the flaws, you fix them, you feel good. You feel like your application is solid and you're not going to have a breach. If you have a breach, that's going to be bad. That's going to be very costly. There could be lawsuits, especially if you're storing PII or anything like that. It's going to be vastly more expensive than hiring a pen test company to test the security of your application. So you can save a lot of money here by pen testing your software. And last thing I want to also mention, this isn't something that I would necessarily recommend, but something that you could potentially do to save costs. There are these websites like Fiverr where you can hire a developer, you can hire an engineer, a QA, a product manager, whatever, designer. You pay them some small amount of money. They're usually located in somewhere in Southeast Asia or Africa or whatnot, some lower income areas of the world. And you pay them some small amount of money and they do a bunch of work for you. It's possible to do this. Right now you're thinking, what? Lots of work for very little money? Sign me up. But actually, I want to warn you, the quality of the work is very hit and miss on these platforms. So you really have to be careful when you're on there who you hire to do your stuff for you. And don't trust the ratings. Okay? Just like Amazon, having 5 stars on Fiverr doesn't mean anything. Just keep that in mind. But it is an option. So if you don't have anybody on your team who's good at UI UX or user interface, user experience, you can go to Fiverr or some other platform and you can hire someone there to create that UX for you. But anyway, these are some strategies here that you can use to reduce the cost of your SaaS application. I hope this was useful. And both this spreadsheet as well as these images here will be available on my website, deployanddestroy.xyz. Thank you for watching. Have a pleasant day, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.